Well, I invite you to join me on another journey into the secret life of the soul. We've been using an analogy to help picture what goes on in your inner life, and picturing your soul as being like a boardroom where the great issues of your life are debated. The members of the board are heart and mind and will and conscience, together with memory and imagination. And I'm most grateful this morning to Tracy Stern. A meeting took place inside his soul in which imagination said, I could draw this. Will said, do it, and heart and mind went to work, and this is the result. Here are the members of the board of the soul as you have never quite seen them before. Focusing in on them individually. Mind is failing to apply himself to the issues that need to be dealt with. Imagination is off on a rabbit trail with a new idea that has just occurred to him. Will is reading the riot act to the other members of the board. Conscience is singularly unimpressed with what is going on amongst the rest of the membership. Heart will go along with anything, just so long as it makes him happy. And memory, of course, is frantically taking the minutes and trying to keep a record of all that's going on. And, of course, the desperate need is for someone to come into this vacant chair around the board table and to give leadership and to give direction to the soul. And that we've been seeing is what the Spirit of God will do when you come to faith in Jesus Christ. It's a great picture, and it raises for us, I think, profound questions. And the question is this: how can you find rest for your soul with all this going on inside you? Here, after all, is the soul in turmoil. The members of the board pulling themselves in different directions. Sometimes even the individual members of the board can't decide which way to vote. The Bible says the double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. If mind doesn't know where it's going, then you're certainly going to be on an unstable path. The will can be divided. We've all experienced that. The affections of the heart can change and fluctuate. There's a restlessness within the human soul. And that is why it is possible to have a good job, a happy home, and at the same time a growing feeling of emptiness, an inner ache, a restlessness that goes to the very core of your being. And I wonder if you have sensed that restlessness. Psalms give us a great picture of this inner turmoil. For example, I'll quote from two Psalms this morning. Psalm 131 and verse 2. 131 and verse 2. David says, I have stilled and I have quieted my soul. And then he gives this wonderful picture, like a weaned child with its mother. And he repeats it to reinforce it. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. Think of the young child in the process of being weaned. Here's this little scrap, and he's got a good pair of lungs on him, and he knows how to scream, and he bawls the place down. Now, David says, that's what my soul was like. My soul was in turmoil. It was distraught. It was crying out like a screaming baby. But he says, I've stilled my soul. Like the weaned child. Here's the child now who, having been weaned, finding contentment, is now in the mother's arms, on the mother's shoulders, but has found contentment. The screaming has stopped. The child is at peace. He has found rest beside the mother. Now, the great question is, how can that happen? How can that happen with the deepest cries that come out from the inner turmoil that goes on inside your soul? How can you find rest for your soul? How can you find rest for broken heart? How can you find rest for frustrated will? How do you find rest for hungry imagination? for unhappy memory, for burdened conscience? How do you still a confused, perplexed mind? It's our question this morning as we come to the Bible. How do you find rest for your soul? Now, the whole world is looking for an answer to that question. That's what drives the relentless pursuit of pleasure in our culture. We are looking for ways to quiet the inner cries of our hearts. How can I bring peace to these distraught members of the board? How can I get them working in harmony together? No man or woman can live happily with a restless soul. Now, the Bible speaks directly to this greatest of all questions in both the Old and the New Testament. I'll give the Old Testament answer first, and then we'll see how it flows into the words of Jesus in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you might like to look at Psalm 62 and verse 1. Psalm 62 and verse 1, where again David makes this marvelous statement that needs to be etched into our very being. My soul, he says, finds rest in... Now, how's he going to finish that sentence? My soul finds rest in God alone. Psalm 62, verse 1. My soul finds rest in God alone. The Bible teaches us that you are made in the image of God. That's who you are. And God has placed within you thirsts that only God can satisfy. And your soul, therefore, will find rest in God alone. Some of you know the story of St. Augustine. He wasn't a saint at the beginning of his life, I'll tell you. He was a man with a brilliant mind, a driving will, and a wonderful imagination. He lived in the 4th century, which is a long time ago, but he was exactly like us. He was looking to find life. And so as a teenager, 17 years old, he left home, threw himself into a life of indulgence, much to the agony of his mother, a woman by the name of Monica, who prayed for him. Eventually, with his soul hungry, and after years of this lifestyle, he read the book of Romans and he put his faith in Jesus Christ. And this is what he said to God. He said, "You have made us for yourself, so our souls are restless until they find their rest in you." He was saying what David said in Psalm 62. My soul finds rest in God alone. There is no other place where there is rest for the soul. Now that leads us directly into the New Testament answer to this question, which of course is exactly the same. The whole Bible is one story and is united together. So please turn over now to Matthew chapter 11, which was read for us, and notice that Christ begins with one of the greatest statements of his deity in the whole of the Bible. Matthew 11 and verse 27, "No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." Now, he's not saying that he knows the Father in the sense that you might say you know someone because you met them at a party. No, he's talking about a complete and unique knowledge that only he has. You could enjoy the most wonderful marriage for 50 years. You could know your husband and your wife, or your wife intimately, but even after a lifetime, you could not claim that you knew everything about them. But God the Father knows all that there is to be known about God the Son, and God the Son knows all that there is to be known about God the Father. No one else is in this position. But Jesus says, because I am in the unique position of knowing everything that there is to be known about God, everything that there is to be known about the Father, I am also in the position to reveal the Father and to make him known to you. Now put these 3 simple steps together. Your soul finds rest in God alone. So the greatest question you face is, how can you know this God in whom your soul will find rest? Jesus says, I have the answer to that question. No one knows the Father but the Son. I know everything that there is to be known about God, and as you come to me, I will make that knowledge of God available. I will reveal it to you. Come to me, and I will share my knowledge of the Father with you, a knowledge that none other can introduce you to. Come to me, and you will know him. Now, in this most marvelous statement in the New Testament, I want us to notice three very simple things. I want you to notice the audience. I want you to notice the invitation. And I want you finally and briefly to notice the promise. First, the audience. You who are weary and burdened. Now that's who Jesus is speaking to this morning. You who are weary and burdened. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but if in any sense you relate to the word weary and burdened, Jesus is speaking to you. You are the audience. Come with me into the boardroom of the soul as we try and unpack Jesus' words, weary and burdened. The members of the board are gathered together in somewhat dejected mood. I'm anxious, says Mind. Certain recent events have made me more nervous. I have an increasing awareness of danger these days. On top of that, as I get older, I find that there are many questions that I simply cannot answer. I used to think I knew more answers than I do now. I find this disturbing. It makes me restless. I'm feeling heavy, frankly, says Hart. I've given myself in love, and I've been disappointed. I honestly feel betrayed. I've actually been broken. I sometimes feel it would be better if I held myself in check, says Hart, because when I open myself up, I always wonder if I'm going to end up being wounded. I'm frustrated too, says Imagination. I'm constantly looking for new possibilities for the future, but as soon as one of my dreams is achieved, it seems to disappear from view. And I have to think of another one. The rest of you keep telling me, Imagination, you say, come up with a big idea that's worthy of the full devotion of our lives. And I've come up with lots of ideas, and you lot are never satisfied. You're pretty hard to please. Nothing is good enough for you. Conscience is also struggling. He is aware of some things that have been done that should not have been done. He's tried to get them on the agenda for discussion with the other members of the board, but he's consistently been told he's out of order. He finds himself frustrated and burdened because he is living with issues that the board refuses to discuss. Memory is a different problem. The board listens to him, but none of them is able to do anything about the problems that he raises. Memory shares his regrets. Memory talks about the things he wishes were different. Memory says, I wish that had never happened. And Mind says, I agree. And Heart weeps. And Will says he wishes it hadn't happened too. But at the end of the day, nobody can do anything that makes any difference. So says Memory, where am I to go with my burden? Well, just so that I don't get missed out, says Will, I'm frustrated too. And I'll tell you why. I know what I want, but as often as not, I don't get it. And that's why I get angry so often. I'm tired of being told by the rest of you on the board, try harder. I'm fed up living under the burden of this word, ought. Ought. Any of that going on in your soul? Jesus speaks to the weary and the burdened. That's the audience. And if you know anything of restlessness of soul, he's speaking to you. That's the first thing. The audience, weary and burdened. Here's the second thing. The invitation to you. Jesus says to you, come to me. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and you will find rest for your souls. Now, I think that there are some of us who have got to the point where we believe this. It makes sense to us that we're not going to get it sorted out without God. But here's our problem. We're not really sure what it means to come to Jesus. That's where we've got stuck. How would you do that? And what would it actually look like? Now, David wrestled with that issue in the Old Testament. He recognized that his soul would find rest in God alone, but he wanted to press beyond the theory. It couldn't just remain out there as something that he believed. And he says, again in Psalm 62 in verse 5, he says, find rest, O my soul, in God alone. You see, he's not just believing something now, he's doing something. He's speaking to his soul. He's bringing his soul to God. Now, it seems to me that that's where some of us have encountered problems. I want to try and open that up just using our model in a way that I hope will be helpful this morning. Let me introduce you to two representative characters who I've named at random, John and Mary. See if you recognize them. John was brought to church when he was young. He can't remember a time when he didn't believe. He believes in God and in Jesus Christ. He believes Christ died for his sins and on the third day rose again. John did well at school and then he launched himself into business. After 10 years, he started his own company that has been successful. His business is the biggest thing in his life, and though he has a wife and 3 kids whom he loves dearly, it remains the most important. John still attends church, and he finds it interesting. But he finds it difficult to get motivated, he says. And yet there is a great hunger within his soul. Now let's just think for a moment about what has actually happened in John's soul. Early on in life, mind came to believe in Christ. But at least from the information here, imagination has never been captured. In fact, imagination is pursuing another dream that he's embraced. Heart has never been engaged, and so will finds it hard to get motivated. So what's going on inside John is that there is a division in the boardroom of his soul. Mind believes, but the rest of the board have never been persuaded. So instead of the whole soul coming to Christ, what happens is that the rest of the board members of John's inner life regard his faith as an interest of the mind. And so the soul itself remains restless. Now, let me give another variation of that. Let me introduce you to Mary. Mary went to the youth program in church, where she made some good friends. Over the years, a number of folks in the group spoke about coming to Christ. Some were baptized, some gave their testimonies. When Mary heard them speak, she wished that something special would happen to her like it had happened to her friends. She prayed about it, but for a long time, nothing seemed to happen. Then, one weekend, she was at a camp, and it happened. The crowd were sitting round a campfire, and everybody had been singing. Then some began sharing, and Mary just knew in that moment that God was real. She could feel the love of God flowing over into her heart. It was wonderful. She prayed a prayer of commitment, and she told her youth leader and her friends. Everyone was thrilled. It was one of the greatest nights of her life. That was 20 years ago. Now she is raising 3 young children, and although she enjoys being a mother, she has a restlessness in her soul. Sometimes she says God seems terribly far away from her. And now she has begun to wonder if what happened that night at the youth camp was just a youthful rush of enthusiasm. Now let's look at what's gone on inside Mary's soul. She came to Christ with her heart. There was no doubting the authenticity of that experience. But her problem was, at least from the information here, that her mind was never engaged. Listen to this from Os Guinness, who puts it so perceptively. The understanding was not in control at the time of faith, so it was not in control at the time of doubt either. The emotions were everything when faith was there, and now that doubt is there, the emotions are still everything. All that really is different is that they have changed sides. In other words, what Mary has known, despite the authenticity of her emotional experience, is simply that she has had different experiences at the emotional level, which is another way of describing mood. She's responded to Christ with her heart, but not with her mind. So there's a division within her soul in which heart says, it's real. I know it's real because I felt it. And mind says, I don't think so. And then heart says, well, right enough, I don't feel it now. And it won't be long before heart gives in to mind, because the heart can't embrace what the mind won't believe. Now, do you see where we're going with this analogy? You could spin it in all kinds of ways with different members of the soul who individually come to Christ. But the point I want to make is this: that when Jesus said, "Come to me," he was speaking to your whole soul and not part of it. The Holy Spirit may begin a work at any level. In Lee Strobel, for example, who's written wonderful books, the Tribune journalist who was on staff at Willow Creek and now out west, wonderful ministry of writing. The Spirit of God began a work in him in his mind. He became persuaded, but it didn't end in his mind, it just began there. The Spirit of God may begin a work in Mary's heart round the campfire with a true experience of the outpouring of the love of God, but it can't end there. Conversion is not the persuasion of one member of the boardroom of the soul. Conversion is the bringing of the whole soul to Jesus Christ, and that is where we find rest. And some of us have never found rest because we've never known what it is to come to Christ with our whole soul. We just believed it since we were a child, which is a function of mind. We just felt it when we were at some convention, which is a function of heart. I'm not doubting the authenticity of these things. I'm questioning the adequacy of these things. There is no rest within your soul until the board is agreed. If the board is not agreed, the board cannot act. Listen to how Moses put it in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 10. Turn to the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul. That's the only way you can come to the Lord. With all your soul. Jesus said, "Come to me, you who are weary, you who are burdened. This is what you've got to do. Come to me." But not a part of you, the whole of you. All that is within you. Okay, you say, that makes sense to me. I can see why there wouldn't be rest for the soul unless the whole soul comes to Jesus Christ. But what does that look like? And Jesus spells it out right here in Matthew 11, verse 29. Look at it. 2 things. Take my yoke upon you. That's the first thing. And learn of me. That's the second. That's what it looks like to bring your whole soul to Christ. Take my yoke upon you. Now, the yoke was a harness, really, that tied 2 animals together to keep them in line when they were plowing a field. And once you were in a yoke, You couldn't get out of it. So when Jesus invites you to take his yoke on you, he's inviting you into a relationship that is binding. Now, there are some people who want to walk with Jesus, but they also want the freedom to depart from Jesus when he takes a difficult path. And if that's where you are, there will be no rest for your soul in that. No rest for the soul comes to those who are ready with their whole selves to yoke themselves to Jesus Christ. Coming to Jesus means I bind myself to him. Wherever you go, I go. Wherever you lead, I follow. Whatever you say, I do. Not only is it a binding relationship, when Jesus uses this picture of the yoke, it is an exclusive relationship. Think of these two animals being harnessed together. You cannot be yoked to many people at the same time. Take my yoke upon you, says Jesus. You get bound to me. Now, if I'm to yoke myself to Jesus, that does mean that I've got to detach myself from other yokes. And the problem for some of us is that we never really get yoked to Jesus because we are already yoked. Christ says, take my yoke upon you. And we say, sorry, Lord, I'm already yoked to pleasure. I'm already yoked to popularity. I'm already yoked to success. Or perhaps worst of all, I'm already yoked to myself. Now, Christ says you've got to break up that yoke. There's an intentional decision there, and you take my yoke upon you. This is a binding, exclusive, and purposeful partnership. Because, of course, the purpose of the yoke is to make sure that these two animals keep together in plowing the field. There's a purpose to it. And the yoke makes it possible for you to play your part in his purpose. It delivers you from doing your own thing out there in the field and missing the purpose for which God brought you into the world. Take my yoke upon you, says Jesus. And there will be times when in this yoking to Christ, you pull against the cord that binds you to him. There'll be times when it hurts. There will be times when you say, I wish I could go that way. And he says, you're yoked to me, I'm going this way. But I will tell you that on the last day when you see Jesus Christ, you will be so glad that you are yoked to him. Take my yoke upon you. And then he says, here's another thing that's involved. Learn of me. Get yoked to me. Start learning from me. Now, Jesus is using, again, a very simple picture here. He's saying, you have to enroll as a pupil in my classroom. Learn of me. Now, some of us have a problem there because we would rather see ourselves as sitting on the board of examiners. You see, we want to come to God with our questions, as if he needed to pass our test. We have questions for you, we say. We're the board of examiners. And we hope that you can come up with some good answers because we've got a pretty tough test that we've set for you. Now, there are people who come to God like that. And God will never answer you if you come to him like that. He never will. He does not need to sit your test. And as long as you try and approach God as if you were his examiner, you will never find rest for your soul. No, says Jesus, this is how you must do it. If you're going to come to me, then it's got to be on this basis. Just resign from your supposed position on the board of examiners and enroll as a pupil in my class. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. You ready to learn from Jesus? You ready to let him be your teacher? You ready to let him decide what he will teach you now rather than you setting all the questions for him? Will you allow him to lead you into all truth through his word, which is the truth? Christ will not answer your every question. But when you are ready to learn from him, he will show you the Father. And he will give you rest for your soul. The audience. Are you weary? Burdened? Here's the invitation. Jesus says, come to me. Come to me. Not a part of you, but the whole of you, all that's within you. And here's what it'll look like. It'll be a taking of my yoke upon you, a binding, exclusive, and purposeful partnership together. And it'll mean you resigning from the board of examiners and being ready to be a pupil and allow me to teach you through my truth. Learn of me. And finally, and very briefly, here's the promise. I will give you rest. That's his promise. And he will not fail that promise if you will come to him as he's invited you to come. So in these last moments, I want you to imagine Christ himself coming into the boardroom of the soul where the members of the board are seated round the table. And now Christ comes into the boardroom and he looks each one in the eye round the table, looking at your mind, your heart, your imagination, your memory, your conscience, your will. And he has something to say to each one. Mind, he says to your mind, come to me and let me from this day be your teacher. Will, he says to your will, come to me and let us get yoked together. Imagination, come to me and embrace a new dream that's bigger than your work, bigger than your family, bigger than your pleasure. In fact, your work, your family, your pleasure will all be subservient and offered up to this dream. It is the greatest dream a man or a woman can ever know, to live your life for the glory of God who made you and with whom you will spend all eternity. Embrace that dream, imagination. Memory, I want you to come to me, Christ says. Can you hear him say this to your memory? The past is the past and you cannot change it. But the past doesn't need to be your prison house. It can be your launch pad. He says to you, I can redeem your past. I can take everything that has happened to you, what you wished had never happened to you, and I can make that the place where God's glory, his redeeming power is made real in your life. I can make that the backdrop against a new work of God that will be for his glory and for his honor. Conscience, I want you to come to me. I want you to bring that burden. What matters is not whether you can forgive yourself, not whether someone else will forgive you, but what matters most is, will I forgive you? And conscience, if you will bring that burden of your guilt to me, I will forgive you and I will give you rest. And heart, I have something to show you. See my hands. See my side. I love you. And I want to pour that love that I have for you into you so that you may reflect it back. And so that it may radiate from you out into a broken and wounded world. The members of the board were strangely quiet. For the first time, they glimpsed a possibility that none of them had ever seen before. If the whole soul were to come to Christ, the whole soul would be united together. If every member of the board were under his lordship, there would be a whole new basis for operation, a whole new ground of agreement, a whole new vision, purpose, and direction. There's so much I don't understand, says mind. But I do believe what he's saying to me. And I want to start learning from him. I'm tired of small dreams, says Imagination. This is the first time I've ever been invited to be part of something bigger than myself. I've been thinking, says Will, that if I yoke myself to him, I tie myself to the power of God. And if I align my will with his will, then that will get done. It never occurred to me before, says Memory, that the pain I live with could actually become the place where God is glorified. What better thing could I do with what is wretched in my past than offer it up to him and ask him to redeem it? I've tasted love, says Hart. Sometimes it was sweet, sometimes it was bitter, but I have never tasted anything like this. I've carried my burden too long, says Conscience. I've tried to forgive myself, but the burden is still there. I long to be able to lay it down. The motion was that we come to Christ. Let's call the question. The motion was carried unanimously.